All right, that was easy. Okay, up next is Raveen from Deloitte and Milady from AWS.
Hi, everyone. I'm Milady. I lead the Lab of the Future initiatives at AWS. And I'm so very excited to tell you about our new Connected Lab offering. So I will start by telling you the why this, why now, and then I'll tell you about the capabilities that we have found that you need to transform your labs. Then I'll transition it over to Raveen, who's going to tell us about how both of our organizations have been working together to create a suite of accelerators in the roadmap and also some exciting opportunities if any of you want to get early access to this solution. So why this? I'm a scientist that I've spent the majority of my career designing vaccines in academia for NIH. And something that I take as a given, as a fact, is that science is iterative. Now, coming to the world of tech, I see that it's very similar. We all have a very similar way of working, whether you're an R&D scientist in pharma or you're a scientist in a clinical diagnostics organization. Typically, you have a hypothesis. You start with a hypothesis, a test, an instrument that you're running. You get data. That data gets analyzed somehow. And out of that analysis, you get more data, and you learn something. Very rarely do you end there, right? Your career ends. You got your Eureka moment. You get the Nobel Prize. No. Actually, scientific innovation comes from that continuous iterative cycle where you learn a little bit, enough to tweak your hypothesis, for example. Or maybe what this means for you is the first time around, you run a bioinformatics workflow. The next time, you run some statistics, or you integrate your data with someone else's. So understanding that sort of this cyclical nature of science, knowing that, we knew that this, and being able to support that iterative science in the loop, was central to developing a connected lab. So in working with a number of organizations, what we learned is that to have a lab of the future, you need a number of capabilities, four general capabilities. But the question that comes to mind is, why do we call it lab of the future and not lab of today? And the reason is that we still see this as an aspirational goal. We want to get there where labs are seamlessly connected, where you can go through this virtual cycle and connected. And I think one of the speakers talked about earlier, I think it was Steven, he said, if you're just one person, maybe a postdoc or a graduate student doing a project, you can do this very, very seamlessly, right? Your automation is yourself doing things manually, right? Managing your data and so on, you can do that. But as experiments grow, and Steven showed really nicely and illustrated it for us, how complex it gets over time. So what we have found is that there are four major capabilities to turn this into lab of the future and hopefully someday lab of today. On the one hand is the lab orchestration, lab automation piece. So when you think about or you hear the words digital lab, connected lab, this is what people typically think about, right? Advanced robotics, touchless sample processing, event-driven automation. Pretty much what happens in the wet lab, generating activities in the dry lab, and so on. That's one aspect. But also, notice that there are three other modular capabilities that all have to do with data. On the one hand is finding the ability to capture data from all the silos, all the various sources, and moving them to a place you can analyze them, right? So data coming from your instruments, your ELNs, your LIMS, maybe from CROs, out from the public domain, that ability. The third one is the ability to catalog, find, share your data with others, access the data. I'm going to call this data management. And in the fourth bucket, I'm just calling it consumption. And in there, let's say everything that has to do with transforming your data, making the data more interoperable, whether it's sophisticated interfaces for sophisticated users, no-code interfaces, all that type of thing. So the reason this is a lab of the future and not of today is we see that this tends to be very lengthy because it's highly manual. So let me tell you a quick story. Recently talking to one of our I would say one of our most mature from a technological perspective customers, a top 10 pharma, and presented this vision to them, trying to gauge, does this resonate with you? Is this what you see? So the first thing he said was, actually, just to do the third part, the data management, although, they've got catalogs and so on, it takes them 4 to 6 weeks to do this. From having a scientist request a data set, to mapping and figure out what the data are, and giving access back. So think about it, 4 to 6 weeks just for that module, that one modular capability. And that doesn't even take into account how long it took them to get from the instruments to everywhere else and the other capabilities. This is why, and this is at the crux of the R&D productivity problem, because all of these steps are very manual. Another customer talked to me about this and said, you know what, this is exactly it. This is exactly what we need, but today, and this is a clinical diagnostics. So they're in business, right? And their type of business, they go from an order from a provider all the way to a report, lots of workflows in the middle. So to be in business, they figure out a way to do this in a way that's time-bound, right? Maybe they have 5 days, 10 days to get back. But the way they do it today, and I hear this over and over, is they have people, right? So instead of technology, they have Mary, Jim, Mark, different people. So if you want data, you better go talk to Mark, right? And Mark and his team will help you find it. So again, that's sort of part of the inefficiencies that we want to find a way to tackle. All right, slow people, and again, this leads to multi-person discussions, lots of negotiations. So that's sort of the perspective from the end user, the scientist. But what we hear from the research IT teams is, hey, it takes months mapping those data sources. They end up building lots of one-off platforms, which is not what they want to do. So that's sort of the challenges on sort of the end user side. But you've heard about this. You've heard about digital labs and connected labs from us and others for a very long time. So I'm not here to tell you we're tackling a new problem. In fact, again, why we call it Lab of the Future is because, at least from our perspective, so far, at AWS, this is how we have tackled it, okay? On the left-hand side, I have some of those same modules I talked about. At AWS, we're very, very good at generating lots of services, right? And some of you have talked about some of them today. S3, EC2, maybe for the omics workflows, you use healthomics. But when I go back, if I can go back, yeah, and think about this problem, one sort of aha moment and pivot for us is realizing that to get to the sort of end-to-end vision, we have to move away from this Lego block approach. And I think that, as AWS supporting builders, that's in our DNA. But when it comes to supporting science and supporting a vision that is at the heart of R&D productivity, our pivot is taking some of our services, bundle them in almost like a super block service. So what you'll hear very soon is we're thinking about this as an accelerator approach, okay, to make it easier, trying to get as close as possible to an off-the-shelf sort of vision. So that's where you're seeing us pivot in this. Another stat heard recently. So for example, one of the clinical diagnostics, and in fact, if you want to hear about connected labs, lab of the futures, clinical diagnostics are some of the ones that are more advanced in this case. But what they've had to do is take this and build that. And in fact, one of them told us it took us 10 years to get to a well-oiled machine and to get there. So if you think about it, if we want this to be lab of today, it will be a point where tech will be invisible, right? Where it would be so normal, right? That we just call it the lab. This is the lab. And so to do that is something that cannot take 10 years, okay? This is another way to look at that same sort of scientific cycle and to talk about, where are we today and where do we want to go? So really the vision here is we want to create seamless connectivity from the wet lab to the dry lab and back. So if you're someone sort of from the wet lab end, is being able to, things that happen in the wet lab go seamlessly there and get annotated back so that you as a wet lab scientist can see them, observability. For the dry lab scientist, designing the experiments, being able to get the data from the wet lab and so on. And you see that in order to bring those two circles together, it's really about, how can we leverage automation to make this happen? So I've told you a lot about, this is what we see in terms of trends and how anecdotally we are seeing it, and I think the majority of you have been nodding and said, yes, that's what we see. But this is not only anecdotal. In fact, we have data to back this up. So I'd like to invite Raveen to explain this and to share with us some of these numbers.
Thanks, Melinda. Can you hear me? You good? Okay. I just have this one slide, then we're going to switch around. So that's a switcheroo. So what this is if you're familiar with the Pistoia Alliance, they are, yes, nods, yep, okay. So pre-competitive industry consortium in life sciences. They've actually collected quite a good comprehensive set of data through a survey. So they they sent a survey to about 200 stakeholders in the research lab space. So that's from scientists at the bench to lab managers to IT folks supporting those lab staff and through lab operations and executives. And so they were surveyed, and the highlights of the survey are here. So the first question is, what are your top investments, right? Where are you going to spend your money? What are you trying to do? And you can see the numbers up there. 62% said it's going to be driven by AI, ML projects, right? So that's the first big bucket. It's pretty obvious. Second one is, okay, you're going to be generating more data. You're going to be running AI, ML workloads. So you're going to put that somewhere. You're going to put that in the cloud. So your cloud costs are going to go up. You're going to be investing in innovations in the cloud. So that's the next big bucket. And then as we sifted through the data a little more, kind of what was interesting to us is the third and fourth category being ELN and LIMS. And so we're like, okay, that's interesting. So what we're starting to see is companies investing more in their data collection and data structuring infrastructure, right? And so that'll become clear in a second. So then if we skip down to what are the barriers to achieving this more seamless, automated lab of the future, and this is data across 2 years. So in 2023, it was data silos, unstructured data, and then resistance to data sharing or collaboration, right? So we call that the data mining problem. This data's mine, that data's mine, it's mine, right? It's an old joke, but it still works. So, and with the advent of saying, hey, we want to try to apply AI ML techniques to this data, we need to get at that data. So it's no longer your data, it's the organization's data. And that's why we see, if you look at the second column, 2024, the top two issues or concerns, barriers are still the same, but then, the resistance to sharing has dropped off. And we see that as primarily through organizational leadership mandates. You will share your data. You will annotate your metadata so that it can be reused or used for secondary analysis. And so it's really the lack of metadata standardization that's a barrier. And that ties back to the investments in ELNs and LIMS. So companies are recognizing this, and we're seeing a lot of projects to improve their data collection. So that's how we see this kind of cycle happening. And to Milady's point, it's not a lab of today. It's still work to be done to get to a lab of the future.
Thank you, Raveen. Okay, I'm going to get to the why now real quickly. And here, why now? Started hinting at this. We want to take a new approach. We're taking it, moving away for this problem from the Lego block, build yourself DIY approach to a package accelerator. And what the accelerator will be is, the AWS services that you know already, and code wrapped around it so that there's faster deployment. What you see here is also what we're targeting is 60 to 80% of those capabilities I mentioned before already off the shelf, with the rest being customization. And this is by design, because we did not want to create a platform end-to-end that was a monolith, because we realized that we really need to have the flexibility to be able to customize this to different data types, different analyses, and that's why we're designing it this way. The North Stars are going to be that this is going to be an open project, modular, cloud native, scalable, and wherever possible, we're seeking to use standards-based approaches. Another pivot for us as an organization, as AWS, is we tend to focus on the technology. That's our strength. And that's the middle layer that you see here, what you've heard me talk about so far. But what we've seen is that you could have the best, highest performing technology out there and may not get adopted if you don't take into account the strategy and the culture, which is why we're working together with Deloitte, bringing our combined strengths to make this happen. So let me summarize here the solution features before I let Raveen give you a deep dive of what this looks like in our roadmap. So this is going to be a suite of modular, meaning plug and play, okay? If some of these you've already solved are happy, then you shouldn't have to buy into a larger vision. So it's going to be modular, plug and play, accelerator like I mentioned. It is not a SaaS offering, so open and modular. And really the goal is to increase productivity, allow you to do more with less by decreasing manual overhead, decreasing operating cost. And it's really the vision is to take you from a siloed data landscape to a seamlessly connected digitized lab with those rapid, tangible progress. So with that, Raveen, please.
Thank you, milady. Yep. So it's not only a technology problem, and we work with a lot of clients who are investing in this space because it's a major topic. And what we inevitably see is, when we look at their projects. So we come in and we say, okay, you want to achieve something in Lab of the Future. What are you trying to achieve? And what have you got going on? Because nobody's a greenfield. You've got projects already in flight. And what we see are, we get sent a spreadsheet of line items of projects. This project, that project, et cetera, et cetera. And then we start asking some questions, trying to understand the context of those projects. How do those projects actually move the ball forward for you, right? How are they going to advance the organization? How are they going to achieve the aim of having differentiated, higher quality candidates faster, right? That's basically what matters, right? So sometimes that gets lost when you look at tactical granular projects. So what we've built over time through multiple engagements is this kind of placemat, right? So what it is, it's a good view to say, okay, are you activating things in each of these areas? Or are some of these areas completely missing, right? So you might have a lot of technology projects going on. Are you doing the change management? Are you working with your scientists and stakeholders to teach them how their job's going to change through automation and all the other kind of projects happening? So the point of this slide, one, is remember the purpose of why you're doing all these initiatives. Why are you upgrading your ELN? Why are you upgrading your LIMS system, right? So it's to get higher differentiated, faster candidates. So to do that, the strategy from the top has to be aligned, and it has to propagate down to the scientist level and the lab leaders and the project leaders. I have to be careful what I say, but we've seen situations where in a certain modularity, the company's not investing as much and deprioritizing, but that news hasn't trickled down to the folks who are actually executing projects, right? So that needs to be unified. That leads to transparency into portfolio insights. I've got a whole bunch of projects happening in my portfolio. What is the status of each one? And I shouldn't have to, spend months to figure out what's the status of a project. I should be able to quickly assess and get the data. And then, going down kind of the middle of the fairway, as we call it, the golfing analogy. So what you want to do is to get those insights, you need a data foundation, you need knowledge management, because how many people have heard the case where, it's too hard to see if we've done this experiment before, I'm just going to run it again, right? And I don't trust what was done before because I don't know the conditions, I don't know all the metadata, I don't know what samples were used. So that's a tremendous waste, a waste of time, a waste of money and effort, a waste of samples, right, which are very, very precious. So that's kind of the knowledge management aspect. Then what you need to do as well is remove the friction points, right? So you're generating data, the instruments generating the measurements. That needs to flow as seamlessly as possible into this environment, as touchless as possible, right? Otherwise, you're paying expensive PhD level scientists to take a USB stick or, retype something before you can actually do the analysis and see those graphs that we were seeing in previous presentations. So the point of this is that this is all connected. You got to have something happening in all of these areas, and you got to pull it together. So that's a useful framework or a mind map when we speak with pharma customers, right? So looking at that middle piece, the technology piece, so you've got the data producers on the left-hand side. So those are your instruments, right? You've got various computers in the lab, data storage devices, et cetera. So the first thing is that needs to efficiently move from where it sits into a computable environment, into a cloud environment, right? So the orchestration at scale of moving all this data, all these files, is almost like, it's like oxygen. You have to have this in place. Otherwise, you've got a lot of inefficiencies. And the data we're talking about is, data files off of instruments. It could be structured data. It could be images. It could be, other forms of data that need to get moved. So the first job is move all of that, right? Orchestrate it. There's a control tower concept that we're constructing where, okay, just think of like a flight panel in an airplane control tower, airport control tower. Which instruments have been generating data consistently, which ones are stuck, was the data transfer failing? So all of that operational data. So not only are you moving the measurements, the results files, but you also want to be capturing telemetry data, the log files off the instruments, because another use case here is on the operations side, right? If I have, expensive equipment, a cryo-EM, for instance, do I need another one, right? When I can quickly check and see, okay, well, we're only half utilizing the 3 that we already have. So unless there's some other reason we're not aware of, you don't need another one, right? So that's kind of the moving the data over. And then going through, using sound data management principles to then process the data through. And then a key part of this is the metadata around it, which provides the context, right? It's like the lexicon, the decoder ring for all of this data. And more often than not, we see that stored in an ELN, right? So the ability to read from and write back to an ELN is critical, right? So you can imagine, most of the scientists spend most of their time in front of an ELN interface. So that's where they design the experiments. They want to drive the execution of the experiments from there. And so then what you also want to see is kind of the return, right? So once the data gets analyzed and computed, where are the results? Where do they reside, right? It shouldn't be a big exploration exercise to go find it. It should be very readily available, either through the interface I'm already sitting in, which is the ELN, or in a separate interface where I can log into and quickly find my results. So those are the core principles of the accelerators that we're building. This is just a more detailed explosion of this, and happy to go into this in detail in our booth that we have. But the idea is that there's a place for everything in this ecosystem that needs to be connected with the right communications between the two. And we can email these too if you want to save your phone space. So what are we building, right? So the first thing is it's open, right? It's modular, it's cloud native. That leads to the its scalable aspect, and where possible, it's standard based. So the Allotrope Foundation has some really good standards and tools. What they also have is contributors who contribute open source parsers and metadata widgets. So what we want to do is make sure that as we engage with the marketplace, we work with those clients to contribute that back. So as a whole, this problem starts becoming more solvable and more efficient, right? So we have a kind of roadmap that you see there. So phase 1 is really enable this seamless instrument connectivity, moving of the data from where it's created, where it lives in the lab on-prem, move it into a computable environment in the cloud, apply parsers to it so that you've got that level 1 data product, right? You've got the data that you can start analyzing, right? That's phase one. That'll be about the May timeframe. Later on in the summer, what we're also doing is working with early access clients to define research data products, right? So what that means is taking that kind of raw data that's been QA'd and then processing it further so it's more usable for more analyses, right? So it's almost like your analyzed data, your processed and analyzed data. Then the level 3 data products, and we have a whole kind of structure of how we look at this and levels of sophistication, is that's where you start linking data sets together to enable more sophisticated analyses, right? Then later on in the year, hopefully December, is where we're kind of bringing together aspects that we're working on now where, a lot of this data hasn't been generated or collected with the thought of integrating it all together in mind, right? So they're still siloed and disparate. And the idea is to apply LLMs with specific domain knowledge to then help construct knowledge graphs to let you traverse the relationships between different modalities of data, different experiments, to derive new novel insights, right? So that's something we're working on. There's also an ecosystem of vendors out there that could plug into this. And then the other aspect to it, which you're going to hear, I'm sure you've heard a lot about at this conference, is the application of agents, agentic AI, right? So, I mentioned this idea of the parsers of the instrument data. So why not have an agent where you feed it the manual for a given instrument and it figures out how to parse the data so that you don't have to be on top of that all the time, right? So that's a lofty, novel goal, and we're starting to experiment with that right now with the idea of, can we get it to a place where we can deploy this for clients later in the year, right? So that's a journey we're on. What we're working on now in the March to May timeframe is pulling together a very small group of early access clients that want to be on this journey to kind of try this out, right? And move the ball forward in their organizations with the idea being open and shareable, right? So that's kind of the journey that we're on. The benefits of that are you get your input into it, you help prioritize the pain points that matter to you most and solving those, and essentially, using that as a way to get these accelerators into your hands faster, right? So really when we look at all of this, right, we see a tremendous amount of investment happening in research, right, earlier in the drug development pipeline. And really, we ask ourselves why, right? Why all of a sudden all this money's flowing into an area where it's been kind of stable, right? So it's really about improving the productivity of R&D. So companies recognize that there's an opportunity there, especially with the advent of AI. So there's new investments that are happening. And what that's triggering are all the things that you saw earlier, right? To feed the AI engine, you need good, clean, high-quality data. You need a lot of it. And it needs to happen quickly. Otherwise, you're going to lose competitive advantage for a space you're trying to dominate. So the business case is there. It just needs to be contextualized in the vernacular of your specific organization, right? It's a transformative initiative. It's not just about selecting a new LIMS system and plugging it in and going. If you remember that placemat, there's a lot of other aspects involved: orchestration, governance, portfolio, digital culture, right? The other aspect here is methodologies have evolved. There's a lot of new things in the cloud that we are leveraging that will be part of the solution. And then really the idea is that, create that roadmap, pick an area that's the biggest pain point for you, and it's solvable, right? So go for it. Thank you.
We actually don't have time for questions, so if you want to point people to your booth, or if there's somewhere they can follow up with you.
We're in the exhibit area 815.
815. Thanks.